Okay. Thank you for being here. We are here with Marc-André Lemburg. He's a Python core developer. He has been he's the co-founder of the Python Software Foundation. But now he will share with us a few tips and tricks on how to manage, how to program in Python with small teams. Thank you, Marc.
Okay, most of what I do was already said. So I'm Marc Lemburg. I am a Python core developer, PSF board member. I'm also an EPS board member of the EuroPython Society. I have a company called eGenix.com. We do Python projects and consulting for our customers. So a customer comes to us with a great idea, they wanted to implement it, they don't necessarily have the right skills for that, and we help them to make that a reality. I'm based in Germany, in Düsseldorf, and, well, I like nice things, so I'm just going to start. Right, so this is the agenda. I'm going to go through the talk. First, I'm going to give a short introduction. I'm going to tell a few things about running projects, then share a few things that we learned in the projects that we ran. If you have any questions, please speak up. I think it's very important to get this talk kind of interactive. If you don't want to interrupt the talk, then you can take notes and we can have a Q&A afterwards and then discuss things there. Right, let's start with the introduction. So what's a typical IT project? What you normally get in an IT project is you get a specification from the customer, which basically details all the things that you have to do in the project. Then you write a prototype, and of course we do that in Python. Then you have to come up with a design. And I had a talk yesterday about how to design these things. And then the next step is you take the prototype and you convert into some real-life kind of language, like C++ or Java. And then you have to deploy and support it. So that's the standard kind of IT project that you normally do. Now with Python, things work a little differently. So first you start again with an idea specification. It doesn't have to be too detailed, because Python makes it possible to easily change your project even within the actual implementation phase and even later on in the deployment phase. So you can easily adapt it to new requirements. So again, you write the prototype in Python. You design while you prototype, so you don't have to do a long upfront design. You can do that in smaller steps. And then the prototype turns into the implementation. So you can completely skip the re-implementation phase. You don't need to use Java or C++. You may need it in a few places where you need lots of speed. Then you can go back to C and then have C extensions for Python doing the fast stuff. But in general, you can nowadays do most of the things in Python. So you don't really need C developers on your project. And then again, you have to run and support. So what are the advantages of doing Python projects? Well, first of all, like I said, you can completely skip the re-implementation phase in Java or C++. And that makes it possible to have a very lean kind of project setup. You can easily adapt to changes. It's very easy to, for example, integrate new features into your application when you use Python. It has an excellent time to market. You can develop things very quickly. You can work with smaller teams than you have to in a Java or C++ project. And overall, and that's what the customers usually like, is the costs are much lower, because you have to pay for fewer developers. And so overall, it's a complete win situation for the customer if you use Python. Now, of course, changing the standard model of IT projects also brings along some problems. The major problem is that you no longer have a try and error phase. What you normally do in an IT project with a prototype, you no longer have, because your prototype turns into your actual product. So you need to be very careful when writing that prototype. So you need to focus very much on design. The code that you write has to be very flexible because you might need to make changes. And something else is very important, you need scalability. And that has to be built right into the design from the start. You don't have this prototype phase anymore, so you have to think about scalability right when you start your application design. Something else that's problematic is that you no longer have this linear project flow. So that there's no longer the possibility to develop the project in steps. You often do have loops in it. You probably know that from agile development, that you write something, you go back to the customer, show it to them, then you discuss it, and you get change requests, and you put those change requests back into the product. In traditional IT development, those phases exist as well, but they're not as tightly bound into the project as with a Python project. And so to overcome these challenges, you need good project coordination. Right, so running a project. Well, first of all, you have to have the project specification. So there are different types of projects that you can run. You can have open source projects, like for example OpenStack would be one, or Python itself would be one. You can have open-ended projects that don't necessarily have a fixed deadline, but they basically say when you have the feature set completely developed and implemented, then you're done, and then you release. We had that in Python some years ago, and changed to a fixed deadline kind of setup. That's a more typical case. You have fixed deadline setups where the customer basically says, I want to launch my new website or new feature or new service on a certain date. And unfortunately, those deadlines, they are usually defined by the customer, so you don't really have much say in that. And because the customers often don't really know how to correctly estimate the time it takes to develop these things, you have very short deadlines. And so that's what I'm going to focus on. Okay, so you know what kind of deadline you have. Now the next thing that you have to do is you have to write a specification for your project. The best thing that you can do is you develop that specification together with your client. So you try to avoid the case that the client comes up to you with a pre-written specification, say a 100-page document that you then have to take and implement. The reason I'm saying that is the customer will usually have a traditional IT project in mind. And in Python, things work a little differently in many cases. So it makes a lot of sense to tell the customer to not spend too much time into developing the specification up front, but to instead make that part of the project. And then you can, because you're working with them to develop that specification, you can take influence. You can, for example, choose the right tools, the right third-party libraries that you would like to use in your project. You can hash out things like licensing problems with those third-party libraries that you want to choose. And you can also try to influence the deadline and the milestones that you have in your project. It's very important to make the customer learn about these things. We've often had the problem that we got a more or less complete specification. We had to go back to the customer and make lots of changes. Of course, the customer didn't like that because they had already invested a lot of time into writing it. And so it's very important, if you have a customer for multiple projects, to tell them that it's better to work that way and to avoid this duplication of work. Okay, the next thing is you need to build a team. Of course, you need some developers, you need a project manager. I'm always using PM for that. There are different ways of structuring your teams. At eGenix, we usually use small teams, and we work with remote developers. So that's what I'm going to focus on in the talk. But of course, there are other setups. In Python in general, you don't have large teams on the projects, because if you make the teams too large, the overhead that gets added by communication and feedback, it simply kills the efficiency in your project. The reason is that it's very fast to develop. You can very quickly develop things in Python. And so the developers often have to go back to the project manager to get feedback about their particular way of implementing something. So the project manager becomes the bottleneck in the project. Yeah.
You mentioned now developers, but testers are also part of the team. Can we add testers to the 10 developers so that we have 15 people in the team?
Actually, that's a good question. I have to think about that. The reason is that we don't have separate testers. So the developers write the unit test. We always run the unit test. So there's no separate step for having testers work on the project. That's something that's usually done by the customers. So they have the Q&A team then work on the application later on. Right. So what I found is that, but that's just my personal experience, is that you can scale this up for Python projects to up to 10 developers, but after that it gets inefficient. So if you need more than 10 developers in a project, it's better to have multiple teams and then have the team project managers then report to the central project manager. Right. So next thing is team location. Typical setup is you have everyone sitting in the office. That works fine. It's very efficient because there's short communication paths. Then you can have remote people. You can have a mix of both. And if you mix both, then you have to pay attention to the communication overhead that you have with remote team members. And it's very important to synchronize both. This is important because the things can easily be done in the office without having the remote people know about it. So you have to make sure that the office people always use the standard communication mechanisms in your project so that everyone knows what the project currently is. And the feedback loop that I just mentioned to the project manager also takes longer if you have remote people on your team. So that's something to consider. Okay, so you want to set up your team. You know how many people you need. And the next step is to find the team members. If you have a large company, you can probably choose from quite a big pool of developers. If you're like us, a very small company, and we usually work with freelancers, we have to go out to the Python community and use our network to find the proper people for that particular project. So what we usually do is we look at the various tasks that we have in the project, the various skills that we need, say, I don't know, PDF generation or web front end or database back end, and then we get specific highly skilled people for those developer positions. It's very important if you have short deadlines that you make the whole team as efficient as possible. So you have to focus on developers that can actually work on their own. Don't need to go back to the project manager a lot. It's very important for the project manager to be able to give a task to the developer. The developer then goes away for a couple of days and then brings back a nicely working Python package. In an ideal world, of course. But that's something that you should focus on, and you should make sure that the people are set up for this. If you have longer running projects, then you can also have people on board that are basically trained on the job, so you have beginners or intermediates on the project. But if you have short deadlines, it's very important to get highly skilled people. Right, how do you get the team to work with those short deadlines? Well, I'm going to talk about this from a project manager perspective because that's what I am in the company. The way that you get people to work quickly is you set deadlines. Just like the customer does with you, you have to set deadlines for the developers and get really angry if they don't meet the deadlines. You have to be very responsive. So if a developer asks a question, it shouldn't take too long for you to answer those questions. And you have to then really work with them to get the problem that they have resolved. You need to give feedback. And the feedback well, I can't say this often enough. You have to give feedback to the developers because they want to know how good their work is. So most of the time, of course, the work is excellent. So you need to tell that to the developers. And that makes them feel right and feel good about it. You also have to give them feedback that you learn from the customer, which is also very important. And of course, as project manager, you have to work just as hard as the developers so that they see that it's not just them working hard, but you're working hard as well. Communication. There are two lines of communication that you have in a project. One is from the project manager to the customer, and the other is from the project manager to the developers. I found in my experience that you should always avoid communication between the customer and developer, or the developer and the customer. The reason for that is, there's actually many things. It's, for example, developers to customer. If you have that kind of communication, the developers, they don't know the setup that you have with the customer. They don't necessarily know what you've discussed with them when setting up the projects and contracts and everything. They may not know about, or may not have the proper communication skills to talk to the customer. So that kind of direction of communication can cause some problems and conflicts in your setup. The other way around also doesn't necessarily work. For example, if you have a customer talk directly to a developer, the customer can put pressure on the developer. And then the developer doesn't know how to react to that because there's no project manager in between to buffer this pressure. And that's something that's very difficult to deal with for the developers. And if you can, you should not, for example, give the email addresses of the developers to the customers so that they can use that path. They often like to use that path or want to use that kind of path because, say the developer is not reachable for some reason. They want to be able to directly talk to the developers, but it's better to just keep them waiting until you get back and you can handle the case. Yes?
Wait, where's the question?
Usually between iterations, previous company I used to work with, they would always have a feedback session where for that one period, clients and the developers kind of were able to say, well, did we understand correctly the requirements? Are we headed in the right direction? That of course caused the whole idea of feature creeps coming in and all that. I was just wondering, is there such a thing as having a feedback moment between the client and developer, or should that even that should be avoided?
I would avoid even that. I would just have the project manager be the central contact and not have direct communication between the developers and the customers. It's because, I mean, the way that developers communicate is often very different from the way that the project manager communicates with the customer. It has very much to do with politics in setting up your, in the communication. You have to be careful what you say.
Okay, because really the motivation behind that was a lot of the times the customer did not really know what they wanted. It was more like, this might be what we want, show us something, we investigate, and we provide feedback, and that's pretty much how the back and forth was happening.
Right, that's something that the project manager should do. That's what I have on this slide here. This is basically about the customer communication. So the project manager needs to give regular status updates to the client, of course. That's very important. The project manager also has to get the client to tell him about project changes. This may be obvious, but in reality it's not. So it often happens that the client makes some internal changes to the project or to the expectation of the project and doesn't tell the project manager. So you have to be really pushing for getting that information. You have to manage the deadlines, you have to be very transparent about everything. And with transparency, what we usually do is we give them access to our bug tracker so that they can look at the bug tracker. Then again, in reality, they never do, but they feel very good about it to be able to access everything.
I see. Thank you.
Right, and your point was basically about developing and updating the project specification during the project, and that's basically this feedback loop. So you have milestones in your project, and every time you reach a milestone, you show it to your customer, and then you get feedback from them, and then they say, well, I wanted this differently done, or I want this to look like that, or I need this new feature, or you've implemented that in a way that's not really what we thought it would be, this kind of thing. Okay, next stage, project communication. This is very important. We tried in a few projects to do daily meetings with the developers. So we had a 1-hour meeting every day to get updates from everyone. That turned out to be very, very inefficient because in the end we ended up just basically discussing the problems of 2 or 3 developers in that meeting, and all the other developers were just sitting there waiting for the meeting to be over, to continue to work again. So we stopped doing that. There are various approaches to do project management to, for example, do weekly meetings. After the experience with the daily meetings, we decided that we don't need regular meetings. Instead, what we do is we do meetings on demand. And we always have a chat window open. So all the developers can always see what's going on and can also see the discussions. But they don't have to sit there and wait for a meeting to get over. They can continue with their work and only monitor the chat window every now and then for any new updates. And then if something happens that needs all of the developers to be informed, then you do a meeting. Yes? I think we should probably cue the questions a bit more.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's something you might know. Just saying have you tried stand-ups and your team is like a grown team, do the developers know each other like for years, or do you shuffle your teams around? So stand-ups and team.
You mean this kind of weekly stand-up thing?
No, daily. Like
daily.
30 minutes. Because an hour is very long, but
right.
Just 15 minutes or 10 minutes, it looks pretty good, I think.
Well, we always work with remote people. So if you do a remote meeting, then weekly stand-up, it still takes long because only one person can speak and all the others have to then listen and stand there. We found it's much better to just use the chat window and do this asynchronously. But that's just our experience. I mean, of course, it probably works in different ways as well. So this weekly stand-up or daily stand-up might be a good idea for other teams.
In the teams I work in, it's also like 5 people maximum or something. And yeah, we did daily stand-ups, even remotely with something like Hangout, for example. And it's basically just everyone says, is everything fine? Do I have tags? Do I have any blockers? And that you can then say, okay, I have a blocker here, I need you and you afterwards. And in general, it's like 15 minutes or something where you just go quickly through it and then decide, okay, we need another meeting, or yeah, we can just continue.
Right. Yeah, maybe we should try that again with a 15-minute meeting. After this attempt to do daily meetings, we basically just thought it would be better to just use a chat window, and it worked out well for us, but of course it doesn't necessarily mean it works out well for everyone. Right. Just see what we skipped them. All right, initial setup. So you have your team set up, you have the specification written. The next thing that you have to do is you have to set up milestones for your project. This is very important because first of all, every now and then you want to show your customer where you are. So you want to have something that more or less works and that you can then take into a customer meeting and demonstrate. you also need this for the feedback loop. It's also very important for the developers to work towards something that they can then basically release, sort of. So the way that we do it is we typically have a setup phase where you basically set up all the tools that you need for the project, basic documentation. Then we have a concept phase where we try out various things that we have in the project specification and see, for example, which third-party tools would be necessary and how would actually work. And then you have to send it out for better release candidate and release phase. There's nothing special to that. After the release, you always have a support phase, or you have, if you know that the product is going to be developed over a certain amount of time, you have update releases. So for the update releases, you always collect new features, you implement them, and then every now and then you do an update. I'm mentioning this separately, the update and the support releases, because the amount of activity in the project goes down significantly after you have a release. That's simply because the product will actually then get used. You have a short, very intense support phase usually after the release, because obviously then you have bugs in the application. You can't avoid them, so you have to fix them very quickly. But then after a while, things get more quiet, and you can focus on other things. If you have a longer running project that has multiple releases, you always have to be aware of that. So it may make sense, for example, to scale down the development team size during this more quiet phase, and then ramp it up again for the next update release. In any case, we do milestones every 2 or 4 weeks, so you don't have to wait too long for the milestones to go back to your customer and get feedback. It's also very important to have project documentation set up. This is important for, well, basically so that you don't lose information, because you discuss things in the project, you make decisions in the project, you come up with certain setups that you need, and you should always document those things. We use a wiki for that. Other people use text files, REST files. You can also use Word or Google Doc, or even a whiteboard, and then, if you're in the office, and then put things on the whiteboard, or an Etherpad if you're working remotely. Task management, really nothing much new there. You use a ticket system, of course. The only thing that you have to be careful with is that when you open a ticket with a certain task, the task should be easily manageable. So it should be implementable in a few days, not weeks. Of course, you can also open a ticket with a task that takes something like 3 or 4 weeks to implement, but then that needs to be what we call a meta ticket. So it's not a ticket where you actually put all the patches on. It's just a ticket for organizing other tickets that you open for the smaller tasks. So, like in the talk yesterday, you basically take a larger problem and break it up into smaller pieces, and then you associate those smaller tickets with that bigger one. Ticket categories. Yeah, we use Track for doing the ticket management. It offers various kinds of types of tickets. We found that the type of ticket is really not that important, because we rarely filter on that. Maybe you have a special kind of type for features that you come up during the project that you might want to implement, maybe ideas. We have that in our system. But other than that, you just have a task ticket type, and that's it. The components that you have should map to the components that you have in your application design, and of course you put the milestones in there. Right, so how does the work assignment work? So the project manager is in charge of assigning the work to the various people. The project manager usually also opens these meta tickets. The assignment itself should ideally, if you want efficient work to be done, to be based on components, so not tasks. So you have in your team, you typically have developers that own a particular component in your project. And then if you have something to do with that, you have some tasks with that particular component, you assign to that particular developer. It's very important to do loose coupling with those components, because if you let's say you have a typical problem where you have dependencies, for example, is when you do reports. So first you need to define a report, how it looks like. Then you need to get the database to actually create the report, and then you need the report to be, for example, exportable as PDF. So those things, they need different people usually in the project. So all people have to wait for the database database developer to actually write the SQL that's needed to build the report. And then for the output, you need one of the web guys to do the web report, and you need one of the PDF guys to do the PDF report. So you don't have loose coupling between those. So there's a dependency. Everyone has to wait for the database developer. So what you need to do is you need to make it possible for the people waiting on this database guy, for example, to be able to work on other things in the meantime. Right, and the next phases in the project are, of course, you have to actually do the work after you set it up. Then you have the release, and then you have the support. Afterwards, you have the finalization phase. I'm not going to go much into detail here because I don't have enough time for this. I might do some other talk about this maybe next year. The basic way that it works is that you go in cycles. You meet your well, hopefully you meet your deadlines. You go to the customer, show them your milestone. You go through the specification again. You check whether everything is okay, whether the customer actually expected things to work in that way. What we found in projects very often is that you sometimes reach a point where you need information from the customer. For example, you need some maybe laws that you need to implement, certain rules that you need to implement. The reports have to look in a certain way. So the project manager always has to go to the customer and try to get that information from the customer. And often enough it doesn't really work on the timing manner. So you don't get the information quick enough to actually implement and meet those deadlines. So what we usually do is we just make up some assumptions for these things. Or we just, for example, for a report, we just write a very simple template and then just use that for the time being. We found that to be the only way to actually work with some customers because it just takes much too long to wait for them to get back to you. And then we show them the work, and of course they complain because things don't work like they had expected. And then we explain that we didn't have the information, we had to make some choices for them, and then we just fix things. And that's again something where you need to educate your customer and make them learn that these things are necessary and important. Right. So lessons learned. We found there are different types of customers. These are just a few. One is a very experienced customer who already knows how Python works and how efficient Python is, and of course they expect you to be very efficient and very quick in everything that you do. You need a different way of talking to these kinds of customers than the other types that you have here. There's one type of customer that we often have is you have a customer that has great ideas, sales people that have great ideas about the product, but they have absolutely no IT experience. So they have no idea, for example, of coming up with proper estimates. If you're lucky, you can talk to the people before they publish deadlines. For example, before a product manager goes out to the public and says that in 6 months we have this product. If you're not so lucky, you just get that deadline, you have to deal with it. And then we have had customers in the past that were actually selling solutions that didn't exist yet. So they were basically telling the customer, well, in 6 months we want to install this application on your system, and not a single line had been written. So not even the specification was done yet. So sometimes it's a bit difficult. So how can you deal with that? Well, first of all, you have to be very, very clear in talking to your customer. You have to tell them what the limits are. You have to tell them that you're just a human And of course you make mistakes and things don't always work as intended. You have to tell them about this concept of bugs. Applications tend to have bugs, even if you try to write as many unit tests as possible, you're still going to hit a few bugs, and then you have to discuss with the customer to match up their expectation with the realities of software development and find some kind of balance here. For example, if you get a chance, it's very useful to define milestones together with them, and then, for example, move features that they want in a very early phase to a later phase in the project, and that frees up time for other more important things. You need to educate your customer in software development because they often don't know how software development works. We sometimes have customers that, for example, knew a bit of PHP and then they sat down and wrote a prototype in PHP. It took them half a day, and then they thought, well, it can't take much longer to write that in Python, right? So, of course, if you're developing a production quality application, you have to have different things. You need to have unit tests, you need to have error handling, you need to have proper logging, you need to make sure that the application continues running in case something goes wrong somewhere, all these things. And of course that takes time to implement, and you have to tell your customers that it takes time to implement. Something else that I talked about that yesterday, refactoring is very important. So even though you've written something and it works, and in the milestone you can show your customer that things actually work, they may come up with new features based on what you show them. And then you find that those features don't really match up to the implementation that you've done. And the right thing to do, of course, in software development is then to look at your code, refactor it so that it can handle both cases, the one that you've already shown to your customer and the new feature. And this is sometimes a bit difficult to tell your customer because basically they're paying for refactoring, for redoing something that's already been done. So yeah, you need to really demonstrate that this works out. Then if you're in the support phase, support basically means you watch the application running and you try to fix bugs. If you've done a good job in your project, then of course there won't be many bugs in your application and you won't hit very many roadblocks. On the other hand, watching the application, monitoring it, and looking through the log files and doing data analysis of what goes in and what goes out takes time. But that's something that the customer doesn't see. So basically, the customer never gets any feedback from you, but you're still billing them with a high amount of support hours. And of course, they tend to not understand. And so that's something, I don't have a good answer to that one. It's just, I mean, you're basically selling just warm fuzzy feeling to them. And they will only notice if something goes wrong and then yell at you. And if they're not seeing anything go wrong, they'll just, and especially their controllers, will just then come to you and say, well, why do we need this in the first place? A similar problem is that during the milestone phase, if you're always on time with your milestones and you meet all the deadlines, of course the customer should be happy about that. And then in reality they get used to it. And so if you come up to a milestone that's really hard to meet, where you have really tight deadlines, and you miss that deadline, they get really angry at you. So again, this is something that you have to tell your customers. You have to give them the right impression that meeting those deadlines was really hard work. They should be more careful about adjusting their deadlines. And you have to tell them that this is not the standard case necessarily happening if they set the deadlines the way that they used to. So again, you have to talk to your customers, be clear about these things, and then they tend to understand and come up with more realistic deadlines. Okay, so I've been talking about deadlines a lot in the talk, so I'm going to focus a bit on estimates. So how do you come up with proper deadlines from your perspective? Well, first of all, it's a very hard problem coming up with proper deadlines and proper estimates for everything. You need lots of experience. The best thing that you can do is you can just create safety margins in your estimates. And basically, the way that I'm going to have a slide later on about that. You need to take many different things into account. Maybe not, you don't know all the different things that you need to take into account. So I've put up a slide here, which is basically a recipe for doing estimates. So some things that you usually don't think about when doing estimates, you don't think about the project overhead. So you just think about how long does it take to implement, I don't know, a certain class or certain function, method, or feature. You don't think about demos that you have to do to your customer. You don't think about mock-ups that they want, because very often they want to start selling that product very early in the development phase. And so they need some kind of mock-ups. Of course, that takes away development time again. Then you have customer meetings. And meetings tend to take away lots of time. Time for refactoring, for unexpected complications. Say you use a third-party library, and suddenly a sec falls on you. So you need to go into that library and try to find the various problems with that library. Then you have the human factor. People get sick, or they go to a conference, or go on holiday, or I don't know. There's so many different things that can happen. You need to factor that into the estimates. And of course, you get new feature requests from the customer during the development, and those cause overhead as well. So what we usually do is we try to come up with a proper estimate, and then we put in a safety margin. And safety margin can be anything between 2 and pi. That's what we usually tend to say. If you want to be on the safe side, use pi, and otherwise just start with 2. But never ever tell them your expected estimate. Right. And that's all I wanted to say. Any questions?
Are you using code reviews in those small teams?
Yes, but we are not currently using any of the code review, the web interfaces that we have for code review. So basically, we look at the check-ins, and we have a mailing list where all the check-ins are sent. It's basically something that we copy from the Python development, where you have the check-in list. Just like in Python, we do reviews on the check-in list. So it works a bit differently, for example, from what the OpenStack team does. We don't have this rigid kind of checking everything up front before actually merging the change into trunk. Of course, we always try to keep trunk working, but if it doesn't work for some reason, it's a small team. It's not that bad a thing to have.
I had a different experience.
All right, yeah. I mean, of course, people start yelling at you while and continuing with this work. You have to manage that.
So hi, very nice talk, and I would like to have tips and tricks on how to get the specification after setting the price, because usually customer says, okay, I want something. We may discuss that later. Tell me the price. Okay, price is down, now up feature.
Yes.
What is the,
right. Well,
any trick?
Yeah, well, trick. The way that we do it is, or sometimes do it, is first of all, we try not to do fixed price projects. Because fixed price projects always lead to that situation that you're talking about. So in the fixed price project, you always have a specification, and then of course people start changing things all around. And what you normally do is you have this concept of change requests, and then change requests are always built by time. So you can do it that way. But I would try to avoid that, because it always gets into discussions, because the customer the customer usually thinks that everything is already defined by the specification, including the new feature that they want to see, and that can cause a conflict. And so it's usually better to just give them an estimate of the project costs, and then if you're good, you're basically they have to pay less than your estimate, the initial one, and you're working just by the hour.
Okay, so you still have a budget, but it's not fixed price.
Exactly.
Say, this is my estimate, and then we will go in steps and build each step so that you know that how much it costs.
Right. And if you see in the development that the costs are going to go over the budget, then of course you have to talk to the customer again and explain to them that all these new features that they want, and it took longer to implement.
Thank you.
Customer communication. It seems like I've had a lot of experiences where the customer really had difficulty, I wouldn't say communicating, but maintaining a channel of communication. I was wondering if there were any form of tools or tricks that you kind of helped, or at least promoted a sense of communication between you and the customer.
Well, for a customer, the customer relationship, it makes sense to have regular meetings.
Right.
Even though it costs time, but it makes sense to do that because like you say, and we've had that too in our projects, you sometimes tend to lose the contact with the customer because they have so many other things to do and are so focused on sales, for example, or have new ideas that they are following and trying to get implemented. And so it's a good thing to have a regular kind of meeting with them or a regular kind of contact with them.
Okay.
So, who takes part in this development specification meetings? Only the project manager? But, usually we found that the project manager talks to the client, okay, comes back, but developers have many more questions, and then the project manager has to go back to the client. So it's
Right, but the way that we do it is that I go to the customer and I talk to them, and because I have enough experience to know what questions to ask, I can ask them the proper questions, and then you avoid this kind of feedback that you otherwise need. Of course, it's also possible to set up a project where you have the application designer a separate team member, and then in that case, the application designer would have to be in the same team with the customer.
My company, we use pocket cards to estimate things, so then no one knows what the other one is.
What's it called?
Pocket cards with numbers, planning pocket cards. So I don't know if other people do that. I think it's interesting because allows you to not know what the others are going to say for this estimate, so you are more, no one would like to speak first, and then I don't know, other people use it, or other possibilities to do that.
You mean in a meeting with the developers? And
Yeah,
asking the
we meet
developers
with
how
our-
everything takes. Yeah?
Well, with our product director, and then we have all the stories we have to do for a certain thing, and then each of the story we have to say how many points this thing is, which point is, I don't know, half a day for one person. And then everyone gives a card, so no one sees what the other are saying, and then in the end we decide, and we discuss after we said, each one said what should be the estimate.
Well, since we're mostly working remotely with the teams, they just, each member just sends an email.
Yeah.
So it's basically sort of like what you say. So the other developers, they don't see these estimates. But then, of course, once we have the estimate, then we, of course, we tell everyone, so that everyone knows these deadlines or the milestones that we have.
what about a single team working on more than one project at the same time? I mean, it's better to move the next one after the current one and make the customer wait, or
It's a good question. We've done that. We found that it's possible to do 2 projects with the same team simultaneously, but more doesn't work. Simply because the context switch that everyone has to do for the projects, it can actually cause confusion, because people think of different specifications when working on one project, and then they switch to the other project and then have a different set of specifications there. So it's probably better to not do more than 2.
Hi. Just as a comment to one of the earlier questions about how we do planning, in our organization we're pretty big, so our equivalent customer is the higher up execs. Ask questions. We have a product owner that fights for our cause to say what can and cannot fit. They then come down to devs and QA to the artwork view what can and cannot fit, and it goes back up to the execs saying this is what the team believes they need to do and what can fit into the next phase. And as another small thing, we strongly feel that buddy coding is really good, even though you do get the time cost of having 2 people do work, so you don't get twice as fast code. You get it done once and get it done right.
I didn't understand that last part.
Oh, buddy coding. So it takes, you lose more time because you've got 2 developers working on the same code and they're not twice as fast, but you get the code done right, so you don't have to refactor as often.
Right, but this the part about refactoring, it always comes in the need for refactoring usually comes into the project not so much when trying to develop something for the first time, but it comes when you get more features that you didn't know about when you started that project, and then you find that you need to rework a certain part of the project. So I'm not sure whether you can actually avoid that.
Yeah, I agree that from my experience in the company, we're always working on a product with a long life cycle, so it's slightly different to what you're doing, but it's a small team working on products.
Right. Okay.
Just a comment about this working on multiple projects to maybe schedule stuff better or fill developer time better. You of course have different micro projects inside your project, so if a developer is blocked on something, he can also plan ahead for some other thing, or maybe improve documentation or work on some other issue or so. So I think the important rule is to somehow make it like an operating system. If you are waiting for I/O, or if you are blocked on something, just switch to another micro project inside your project and just work on that, so you don't lose time waiting.
Right, that's true. There's one thing though, as project manager, that you have to be aware of. When you have, and you can avoid those kind of tasks, when you have a task that depends on, for example, this database guy doing some SQL stuff, and all the other team members are waiting on him, it puts a lot of pressure on this team member. And so as project manager, you have to basically take that pressure off of him, and then maybe reassign certain tasks to other people in order to keep them busy for the time being. Otherwise, the motivation goes down. So. Anything else? By the way, I wanted to say that what I've shown here, that this is the way that we work. It's not necessarily the way that everyone needs to work. It's just something like, I think it would be nice if more and more companies in the Python field could show how they work and what tools they use, what methods they use for doing these things, and then because we could all learn from that.
Any more questions? Thank you very much.